right, well, it's a couple minutes after the hour, so I think it's safe to get started, and a few people might be hopping on. So hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Sierra Klein, and I'm a student at Utah State University and a Critical Thinking Unit Fellow with the AHA Foundation. This foundation promotes and advocates for women's equality and individual liberties. And we are so pleased to be hearing from our guest speaker today, Flemming Rose, who is tuning in from Copenhagen, and my colleague Olivia will be introducing him shortly. And I'm also eager for a robust discussion time during the latter half of this meeting. So as the event continues, I ask that the audience members put your questions in the chat bar, and about 20 minutes into the meeting, we will enter a time of Q&A, and we'll try to get as many of those asked as we can. And it'll end right around 12. So now I will turn the time over to Olivia to briefly introduce our guest speaker.
It is with great pleasure to introduce our today's speaker, Flemming Rose. Rose is an accomplished Danish author and journalist with several published books, his most famous being The Tyranny of Silence: How One Cartoon Ignited a Global Debate on the Future of Free Speech. His literary works had such an impact that in 2017, he received the Danish newspaper Weekendavisen's Literary Prize for most recent book, Besieged. And in 2016 was the recipient for the prestigious Milton Friedman Prize for the Advancement for Liberty. He has also been awarded the Publicist Prize from Denmark's National Press Club and received the Honor Award for defending free speech by the Norwegian Organization Fritt Ord. Along with being an advocate for free speech, he served as a foreign correspondent in Moscow and Washington D.C. for 14 years, and as a culture and foreign correspondent in Moscow, and as a culture and foreign editor at Jyllands-Posten for 11 years. We are delighted today to hear his expertise and elaboration on today's topic, free speech in the 21st century. And now I'd like to turn the time over to Flemming to introduce himself and tell us his story.
Thank you, Olivia and Shira, for that kind introduction. And thank you for the invitation. It's an honor for me to speak to a forum that has Ayaan Hirsi Ali involved. I know Ayaan from many years back when she lived in Europe, and I've always been a great fan of her, and I will try to connect her most recent book, Pray, about the challenge to women's rights in Europe at the moment, and the problem of free speech that is the focus of my most of my public engagement. I will speak for about 15 minutes. I will say a little bit about why I think why do we need free speech? What are the challenges to free speech in general, and more specifically, what kind of challenges do we face today? But let me start with a quote. You know the saying, "Sticks and stones will break my bones, but words will never hurt me." Those usually are words expressed by free speech supporters, but I in fact disagree with those words because I do think, and I think it's very important for free speech supporters to acknowledge that speech can be hurtful, and speech can sometimes have negative consequences. This is not to say I'm in favor of censorship or enforcing new limitations on speech, but I just think that we have to be honest about the fact that free speech can be hurtful, and then the question is, what do we do about it? But why do we need free speech? If you look at the history of the debate about free speech, you'll usually find three main arguments within the literature and in the public space. The first argument is the argument from truth. That is, we need freedom of expression because that is the most important tool we have in order to pursue and find truth. And I think to a certain degree that reality has borne out that argument, even though there are a lot of people who are not interested in truth. So what do we do about that? Another important argument for free speech is the argument from democracy. That is, we need freedom of expression in order to make our democracy work. People need to have a right to a voice and express their opinions, and if they don't have, it will undermine democracy. I think that's also true, but I think the problem here is that there are democracies who value other rights as superior to freedom of expression. For example, individual dignity or state security or other things. And that means that you, in the name of democracy, in fact, can impose quite severe limitations on freedom of expression. And then the final argument that we usually hear is the argument from autonomy. That is, we need freedom of expression in order to be able to be sovereign individuals in control of our own lives, and the authorities, the state, do not have a right to suppress certain kind of speech. We are grown-ups and we are able to make decisions about what we want to listen to and what we don't want to listen to, and make our individual judgments. Autonomy is free speech as important to individual autonomy is also being said to be important for the full realization of us as individuals. We have to take responsibility for our lives, and in order to take responsibility for our lives, we have to be able to have the right to say whatever we want, as long as we do not transgress certain limits that I will come back to. So these are the three these are the three arguments that you hear most often in the literature and in the public debate. But I will add a fourth argument that I think is increasingly important in the kind of multicultural, multi-ethnic, and multi-religious world we are living in. And that is that we need freedom of expression in order to be able to manage our differences or the diversity in our society without using violence, threats, and intimidation. And I think, in fact, that you can make the point that that diverse societies, where you have Muslims, Jews, Christians, atheists, people belonging to different ethnic groups, to different political groups, and so on and so forth, that they experience less violence than societies that in fact do not enjoy freedom of expression to the same extent. And some of you might remember that some years ago I was involved in the so-called Danish cartoon affair. I was the cultural editor of the Danish newspaper Jyllands-Posten back in 2005, and I commissioned 12 cartoons of the Prophet Mohammad, and some months later, a global crisis erupted, and there were violence in different parts of the world, and unfortunately, more than 200 people, I think, lost their lives. And I have ever since been living with a permanent security challenge. Since 2015, I've been living with bodyguards around the clock here in Denmark, even though it's one of the most peaceful countries in the world. And it's quite ironic. For 14 years, I was a foreign correspondent. I covered wars in Chechnya or in the Middle East and Central Asia. But when I returned to Denmark, I ended up in a situation where I had to live with far more security than I had at any point working as a foreign correspondent abroad. But I think if I should say a few words about the overall situation today in the world, I think the world is characterized by two key features, and one is migration. The fact that people are moving across borders in numbers and at a pace never seen before in the history of mankind. And it means that every society, or at least the vast majority of societies in the world, are getting more and more diverse. At the same time, we have another important trend, and that is the digital technology, which means that what is happening in Utah can be followed in Pakistan or in India at the other end of the globe. And that basically means that all of us are either becoming physical or virtual neighbors. So we are living with this challenge of diversity. And when it comes to freedom of expression, I think there are basically two ways to go. You can either say that if you respect my taboo, if you do not speak about things that are sensitive to me or hurt my sensibilities, then I will not speak about what might be hurtful or difficult for you to listen to. And on the surface of it, that sounds very nice. I don't think that the vast majority of people enjoy causing offense to other people. I don't. But the problem with that concept is that we are so different. We believe in so different things. We have so different standards of what is good and bad, what is right and wrong, that if you apply the notion that you should not offend anybody or anyone's sensibilities, you will end up in a tyranny of silence. You will not be able to say anything without causing offense to somebody out there somewhere in the world. So even though this sounds nice on the surface, I think it's the wrong way to go. The other way to go is to ask ourselves, what are the minimal limitations that we need on speech in order to be able to live together in peace? And to me, there are three important limitations of speech. I'm not in favor of unlimited freedom of expression. I think that incitement to violence should be a criminal offense. That if you call for violence against an individual or a group of individuals, I think you should be prosecuted in a court of law. I also think that that people have a right to privacy, that the media does not have a right to invade citizens' privacy and write whatever they want about what is going on in our individual lives, with the caveat that if you're a public figure and if things in your private life is important to your conducting public office, that might be relevant. Privacy, incitement to violence, and in fact, I'm also in favor, I'm not against, I would say, a very narrowly defined libel law. Even though it has to be very narrow because libel laws tend to be abused all around the world. And of course, this is very difficult. It means that we have to educate ourselves in the sense that we are able to take offense. We have to teach ourselves and educate one another resilience, because as I said in the beginning, words might be hurtful, but I think this is a far more productive way to go than to enforce all kinds of limitations on speech that unfortunately is going on right now around the world. Let me say end my introduction by pointing to a couple of challenges that we are facing right now. I mean, today, social media or the internet is the public space. And we have these private tech companies that basically serve as platforms where we interact with one another. And we are very early in this development. We see Facebook trying to, they have established an oversight board trying to work out rules for content moderation. Other platforms are doing the same thing. And it seems to me that, that these platforms are struggling with two fundamental challenges that in fact they aren't new, but they are new in this kind of context. And one is misinformation, fake news. To what extent should it be allowed to distribute false information in the public space? And the other challenge is so-called hate speech. What is the definition of hate speech? What should the limitations be? I think those are the two key challenges, and they are not old. And I think it's very important for the digital giants to keep in mind that if you look at history, these two tools, misinformation and hate speech, have been the preferred ways of legitimizing and justifying censorship throughout history. In the Soviet Union in 1918, right after the revolution, one of the first decrees by the Soviet government was to outlaw any newspaper that distributed misinformation. And basically that was any newspaper that wasn't communist. So if you have the right of definition, and the same goes with hate speech, authoritarian governments, they use the label hate speech against what we would say is legitimate dissent. And they would say, well, you offend our religious sensibilities, you have offended the government of Egypt, or whatever they say. So even though I acknowledge that hate speech and so-called hate speech, because I think it's very difficult to define, and misinformation are real challenges to the public space, I think we should be very careful when we put limitations on this kind of speech, and we should try to learn from history. And finally, let me say, in this context of Iran, that I think that that in fact the most important key to freedom and to freedom of expression is individual courage, because freedom of expression is not nature. It's not. It's not so that that we have freedom of expression. You know, it just comes out of the blue, and we all enjoy it. It's the result of a long struggle where a lot of people sacrificed their lives and their freedom and their well-being in order to fight for these fundamental values. So freedom of expression is about culture. It's about learning to live with things that we dislike without resorting to violence, intimidations, and threats. And that's very difficult because the natural impulse in most human beings is to shut down speech that you don't like, or you throw away the newspaper, you turn off your television, you hang up the phone, you leave the room, or you get angry and shouting at your opponent. So it's very difficult to be exposed to opinions that you hate. But that is what it takes in order for freedom of expression to flourish. And then let me end by making the relationship, or establishing the relationship between Ayan's description of the challenge to women's rights in Europe and freedom of expression. Ayan is making the point that that migrants from other parts of the world, and among them Muslim majority countries, but not only, they come to Europe with an education and a mindset that does not entail the acceptance of equality between men and women. And that is something they have to learn. And therefore, she argues for sexual education in school. She argues for educating boys about what equality between the sexes imply, especially that we have to learn to accept physical borders or limits, that if you say no, it means no. And I would say it's the same with freedom of expression, because if you just let nature rule, then there would be no freedom of expression. It takes culture to cultivate tolerance and freedom of expression, and it also takes culture and education to create an environment where women enjoy the same rights as men. So let me finish here. I think I spoke maybe a little bit more than I threatened to do, but I'd be happy to take your questions now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Flemming. That was very insightful, and I will take the first question myself. I'm very interested to dig in a little bit more to what you were saying about the trends of the digitalization of our world and mass migration, and how that's increasing globalization and more diverse societies, along with what you were saying about censorship, online censorship. And I would just like to ask, do you think there are any cases where censorship is necessary? And if it is necessary, who should be doing the censoring? Should it be governments? Should it be businesses? And how do we allow this to happen while also maintaining diversity and not suppressing dissenting voices?
Thank you for that question, Sherry. That's an excellent question, and I don't think I'm capable of answering it in full, but I'll do my best. I think that by definition, censorship is something that the state does. And I think that if you look at history, the state is in fact the biggest threat to freedom of expression historically. I think for a while we'll be living in a situation where the state has receded, and individual actors and the attempt to enforce new social norms coming from society has put pressure on freedom of expression. But I think, I basically, I'm a free speech fundamentalist in the sense that I think that we need as few limitations on speech as possible. And I really believe in the exchange of ideas and opinions as unfettered as possible, even though it might be hurtful. But I also think that we can, the people who are expressing hurtful things can learn from the reaction to their opinions. That when I published those cartoons back in 2005, I did not anticipate this kind of reaction, and a lot of it came from governments in the Middle East who are not democratic. But I also have to acknowledge that a lot of ordinary Muslims felt offended by this. And I learned something from that experience about, that people can have very different values and opinions dependent on where they are from, what they read, where they traveled, the kind of environment they live their lives in, and so on and so forth. And that's okay. And one of the big problems in this debate is that we are mirror imaging and basically saying, if I was Moroccan, I would not rant against cartoons of the Prophet Mohammed. But that is basically me just enforcing my values and norms on them. But I think that we need as few limitations as possible. But at the same time, I acknowledge that freedom of expression is very difficult. And why is it difficult? Because it takes tolerance in order to enjoy freedom of expression, in the sense that if I say something that other people don't like, and they are in a majority, I'm in a minority, they can shut me up, basically. So they have to be tolerant of the fact that they live in a society where somebody says something that they don't like. And I think that that in today's world there is an unnatural tension between tolerance and freedom. That's one of the things I learned from the cartoon crisis as well, that people believe that freedom of expression and tolerance, they are almost opposite, and you need to find some kind of balance, but that's not the case. In fact, they are two sides of the same coin. That in order to have freedom, you need people to be tolerant of your freedom. And vice versa. So, long answer short, I am against censorship, but I acknowledge that freedom of expression is not easy. It's always quite painful, and it's always something that we have to learn from the bottom up, and that's why we can never take it for granted. If we do not cultivate it, it will go away, because it's not nature, it's culture.
Thank you. Yeah, I couldn't agree more with the idea of perspective on freedom of expression and freedom of speech. It's a difficult subject to really define or see the future with it. But I was also wondering, can you see the future of freedom of expression ever reaching its full potential, especially as like limitations and the 3 limitations you talked about?
Yeah, I mean, I think we are in a quite difficult moment, and also in a paradoxical moment. If you look around the world and if you read Freedom House's annual report on the state of freedom in the world, if you read Reporters Without Borders annual report about the state of freedom of the press, if you read the Economist Intelligence Unit on the state of freedom, Cato Institute also has a freedom index. They all point in the same direction, that for the past 10 years, freedom in the world has been decreasing. And not only because authoritarian governments have become more powerful and more influential, especially China, of course, but also Russia, Turkey, and other countries, but also within liberal democracies. If you take the United States, United States is listed in the last annual state of the state of freedom in the world by Freedom House in spot number 32, right ahead of Argentina, but behind Slovakia, a new democracy in Eastern Europe that only has been a democracy for 15 years or so, 20 years. And you see the same in Western Europe, where I live, that governments are enforcing and imposing new limitations on speech. And why is this a paradox? It might not be a paradox because it might be a logical reaction to a certain extent to the digital technology. Because with the digital technology and with the smartphone, billions of people have received a voice that they did not use to have. And it basically means that if you have a smartphone on social media, you can communicate, you can tell the world what you think, and you can reach out to several billion people if you're able to express yourself in the right language. And the reaction to this cacophonia and sense of a chaotic public space where there is so much noise is among government to enforce new limitations on speech. I think I'm a little pessimistic in the short or midterm, and I don't know what will happen in the longer term. And apart from the technology, I also think that there is not that much support for freedom of expression as there used to be. I think you probably you experience this in your daily life in colleges or in the communities where you live. But it's my sense that a lot of people are skeptical of the value of freedom of expression. And it's a very widely quoted opinion. Freedom of expression is something the powerful invented to trash minorities and attack minorities, and not experiencing the consequences of these attacks. And I think that is a very wrong-headed reading of history. The fact of the matter is that if you look at history and if you look at minorities or vulnerable groups that have been fighting for equal rights, be it women, the working class, ethnic minorities, religious minorities, sexual minorities, their key weapon throughout the ages have been speech. because they have been banned, they have been marginalized, they have been persecuted. Without freedom of expression, they would not have been able to gain the rights they do today. And I think it was John Lewis, the former civil rights activist who passed away not long ago, who said that the civil rights movement without freedom of expression would be like a bird without wings. And I think that's very true.
Thank you. Wow.
Well,
I would like to talk a little bit about truth. At the beginning, you mentioned one of the main arguments for free expression is the argument from truth. And then you also mentioned that, as we know, some people are not interested in truth, and there are different definitions of what is true. So what do we do about that? Or how do we start to combat that?
Yeah, that's why I'm, even though I acknowledge that the argument from truth has been helpful, and in the big scheme of things, I think it is more true than not. But it is a fact that a lot of people are not interested in truth. They are interested in getting their point of view confirmed. And that means that they are not that willing to engage in order to improve their own knowledge of the world or pursuing truth. So what do you do? I mean, what argument do you make for freedom of expression if people don't care about the truth? And that's why I, in fact, think that freedom of expression has value in and by itself, even though I think I understand it's not a very convincing case to make if you cannot point to specific positive value of promoting that right. I mean, the issue right now is, of course, misinformation and fake news, and I think the problem with criminalizing false information or misinformation or fake news is that there is a lot of discussion about what the truth is and what is false and what is not false, and it's a moving target. If you take the debate about COVID-19, and if you look at the CDC's recommendations throughout this crisis as the ultimate authority, it turns out that you have to acknowledge that at some points they promoted fake news when it comes to wearing face masks. They changed their mind back and forth. And as I said with the example from the Soviet Union, it's very dangerous to try to legislate about the truth. That is in fact what some European governments are doing with the criminalization of Holocaust denial. But the problem is in a diverse society that if we respect, I mean, I think Holocaust denial is outrageous, and I think we need to fight it, but I don't think that we should criminalize it, both as a matter of principle, but also as a practical matter. If we criminalize it, we lose the ability to argue against Holocaust denial because it's a taboo. And then you can just say, well, this is a criminal offense, so you need to go to prison. And at the end, you are not able to engage a Holocaust denier and make your case because it's become a kind of dogma. That is one of the key arguments for freedom of expression that John Stuart Mill has in his book on liberty. Yeah, there's a lot of questions I see.
Yes, we have one question. You did mention like how history and parts like how we can look back and how freedom of expression has pushed us and how freedom of expression can help us back. But we have one question too, is how do we get past the suppression of speech that has resulted from the JP cartoons, like an example of history?
Yeah, I guess the question is related to the kind of self-censorship that is now common. I mean, the fact of the matter that very few US outlets published the cartoons back in 2006, and none of the big newspapers. It was a little bit different in Europe. Some of the big European newspapers, in fact, published some of the cartoons or all of them. But today, with the exception of Charlie Hebdo, that suffered, I mean, disastrously. 12 people were killed in 2015 at their offices in Paris. And since then, all European publications have internalized this this threat. So they do not publish these cartoons anymore. And it goes back to my point that the key to freedom is courage. You know, I've said that I don't think you can criticize newspapers or journalists for not being willing to put their life on the line. I will not do that. I've made my own choices. I live in the situation. I do not regret what happened. And I think, to me personally, it makes sense to stand up for freedom of expression. It's part of who I am, and as a result of what I've experienced, where I lived, what I've been interested in, and so on and so forth. But I don't think that I can impose my values on others. But at the same time, I think it's very important to point out that if people, publications refrain from publishing those cartoons, that choice has consequences. You cannot say, you know, I'm in favor of freedom of expression, but I make an exception here because it's dangerous. But apart from that, everything is okay. No, it's not okay. But it's you know, it's not courageous of an editor to say, I'm not doing this because I'm afraid, or I'm not doing this because I'm afraid what might happen to my staff. Even though it's a very legitimate, I think, concern, but you cannot say I'm self-censoring, but at the same time free speech is in a perfect condition. It's not, and that's why you have to stand up at some point and make a decision if you want to defend freedom of expression. And if you look at authoritarian regimes or the way totalitarian regimes have been established, this is exactly the way. It's not so that Russians are less interested in freedom or in the Soviet Union or in China, but it's because the government and other groups have used force in order to silence points of view that they don't like. And this is exactly the same that is happening here. I mean, some people are saying, well, why publish something that you know will be offensive? But you know, there's a lot of things that are offensive. Every time when I turn on my television, I'm offended. Every day when I read the newspaper, I'm offended. And then people are saying, well, these cartoons were published 16 years ago. We know what they look like, so why republish them? But you know, I also know what Joe Biden looks like. I know what Obama looks like. But nevertheless, every time there is a story about them, you will see a photo. So the fact of the matter here is that it's about fear. And we have to make a decision whether we want to live in a fear society or a free society. If we want to live in a free society, we have to be willing to stand up in order to defend values that sometimes come at a price.
Thank you. That is very insightful. We are getting a lot of questions about ways to change the way that society is working right now in terms of accepting free speech. And just to frame this question, the suppression of minority voices and the dissenting voices is not a new phenomenon, but it does seem freedom of speech has become controversial. So why do you think it's become so controversial? Why do people seem to tolerate some things and not other things? And what ways do you think we can change that? A grassroots movement, a better understanding of our own minds, our own psychology? What would you say?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, why has free speech become controversial? I think free speech has always been controversial. And I also think that free speech always is under threat by definition due to the factors that I mentioned earlier, that this is a question about culture and not nature. This is something that we have to practice. We have to educate ourselves and teach ourselves to be able to be exposed to point of views that we really hate and dislike. And that is not easy. It's never easy. But it's clear if you say that words are like violence, that makes it a lot more difficult to defend freedom of expression. Because then when you say something hurtful, it's like punching somebody or beating them up physically, and it's not, even though, as I said many times, words can be hurtful. So I think that one big problem is that we generally live in very good times, in the sense that we are healthier, we are wealthier, in a lot of ways we live longer, in a lot of ways we are in a better situation than ever, and maybe as a consequence of this, we have been overprotective. We have become overprotective of, and our tolerance for, being exposed to things that we dislike has been, this barrier is higher. So it's very easy to say, well, I think I have a right to be comfortable. I have a right to feel good. I have a right not to experience pain when somebody says something that I don't like. But I don't think that's the case. That's not the case. And I think we do the younger generation a disservice by transferring these values to younger generations, even though we may do it in with the best intentions. But if I look back at my own life and my children's life and people around me, I think people grow from challenges. It's painful. You doubt whether you're going to make it, how you're going to move on. But I mean, life consists of difficult situations, and that is the way you grow as a human being. It's like when you have a conflict in your marriage or in your relationship, you need to talk about it. And that is not easy, because it involves the other part saying things that makes you feel bad and maybe painful, because we are not perfect. We are fallible. We make mistakes every day, and it's not pleasant to be told. But in fact, I think that is the way we develop and grow as human beings. So basically, I think this is a question about culture. It's a question about norms, and it's a question about being willing to accept that there are things that might hurt us, but we have to learn to be resilient and overcome these difficulties. I'm not being masochistic here. I'm not calling, you know, for causing pain and things like that. But I'm just saying that this is a far better way to go than instead of establishing new limitations on speech, because that will hurt us in the long run, because it takes away our ability to cope with the problems of life.
Yes, yeah, you made a great point earlier about fear and how a society can choose whether they want to be a fearful society or a free society. And so one of the questions asked, at what point does a society realize they're censoring too far, becoming more of a feared society?
Yeah, that's also a great question. I think in fact it's very difficult to figure out, because, you know, one thing is when the state punishes. They put you in labor camps, they send you to prison, or they even kill you if you say things that they don't like. It's quite another thing to internalize new norms and refrain from saying certain things because you know that they might be hurtful, or that you will become unpopular if you say it. And the big problem with self-censorship is that it is invisible. You cannot see it, and you only learn about self-censorship if people are honest about their motivations. And as I said earlier, it's not very heroic to say that you are self-censoring because you're afraid of speaking your mind. So a lot of people will find good arguments for censoring themselves, like saying, well, why there's no need to offend, there's no need to disagree with the majority. Maybe they are right if so many think in this way. So it takes courage and the willingness to go against the grain. And it's difficult. I remember a famous Serbian writer, Danilo Kish. He was living in socialist Yugoslavia with censorship and the threat of being persecuted because of his writings. And he said, you know, self-censorship is so humiliating because it is like reading your own text with somebody else's eyes. So the self-censor in yourself is not, this is not yourself, it's somebody outside telling you that you have to be careful, and then you internalize this voice, and it's very destructive for creative work. And I also think it's destructive in so many other ways. But that's the way people behave, because it's you want to belong, you don't want to stick out, and you don't want to offend. So it's difficult, but it's very important also for democracy and to open people's minds. I think we should be afraid, and we should fear consensus, and we should celebrate disagreement, because it opens our minds to other points of view, and that in fact improves your own thinking.
All right, it looks like we have just a little bit of time left. I would like to ask just one last question. I wish that we could talk all day. This has been very interesting. Thank you so much. But just to end, I want to ask, you're a Danish citizen, and also you lived in Russia, you lived in the Soviet Union, and I do believe that you have a perspective that we as US citizens lack. And I just wonder if there's anything you've noticed, anything you just want to touch on that might help us, that we might be lacking or misunderstanding in our sphere, in our bubble, that you could help us with.
Yeah. I think an important fact here is, in fact, that I've been married to a Russian for almost 40 years. I met her, Natasha is her name, in Moscow in 1980, and we got married in 1981. And in fact, next week we are going to celebrate our 40th anniversary. And when you are living in a marriage with somebody from another culture, you really have to ask yourself, when you have disagreements and conversations, what here is about individual personalities and what is about cultural background and different perspectives, and so on and so forth. And I think that has been very important for my approach to the world and to trying to understand other cultures. And the most common way, not only for Americans, but I think it's especially important for Americans because the United States is so powerful. And the United States, for a long time, has been able to impose its understanding of the world and what is right and wrong on many parts of the world. So what you do have far more consequences than what a lot of other countries do. And I think the most common fallacy is the mirror imaging. That when you look at another country and at another culture, you see yourself, and you are projecting your own perspective and your own values onto others. And if they have different values, you think they are wrong. And you maybe even think they are evil. Sometimes they might be. I mean, there are evil regimes out there. There are authoritarian governments that suppress their own people. But I think that in order to understand the dynamics of what is going on in another country, you need strategic empathy. You need to put yourselves in the shoes of people living in their country, in that country, with that history. And if you take Russia specifically, I think Russia disintegrated and were dissolved twice in the 20th century. In 1917, the Russian Empire fell apart as a consequence of World War I and the Bolshevik Revolution. They had a civil war. They had hunger. Tens of millions of people died. And the revolution happened also as a consequence of an upheaval from the bottom that at some point looked like a democratic movement, but it ended in misery and tragedy. And also in 1991, the Soviet Union fell apart. That was less bloody, but it was still a trauma. I was there at the time. And even though I celebrated the fall of communism and I celebrated the right to national independence for the former republics, I could also see that that was a very painful experience. I mean, people lost all their savings overnight. They were born in one country, the Soviet Union, and suddenly they were living in another country. So I think, social upheaval and social movements from the bottom that we in the West tend to identify as exclusively positive phenomena contributing to the development of democracy. In Russia, the picture is not so one-dimensional. And that's one of the reasons why I think the Russian government quite often prioritize what they see as security and safety. That is more important than freedom and democracy. This is not to defend their decisions or explain away all the bad things that are happening in Russia, but it's just to say that they have a different history, and in order to understand some of the mechanisms or the support of a lot of Russians for Vladimir Putin may have its roots in the country's own history. even though we might be quite critical.
Thank you for that. So we are going to conclude today's web seminar by thanking our featured speaker, Flemming Rose, for taking the time to help educate us on the topic of free speech. We'd also like to thank the AHA Foundation and Critical Thinking Unit for even making this event possible. The recording of today's discussion can be found on the Foundation's website and their social media page. We appreciate everyone who joined us today, and if you would like to get more involved, please feel free to help out. Feel free to visit the AHA Foundation's website for ways to help. We hope you can take what was said today and apply it to your own life by creating conversation and advocating for what you believe would further one's rights for liberty and freedom of expression and freedom of speech. So thank you again, Flemming, for joining us all the way from Denmark. So.
And thank you for the invitation. This was a great conversation. I really appreciate it. Great questions. Thank you. And keep up the good work.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.